Um, for our next session, I'm happy to present Scott Taylor of Pure Storage. I'll introduce him in a second, but the topic today will be scaling security strategies for developing a layered resilience architecture. And Scott is on. That's good. So one of the things I just wanted to mention is that Scott is the Director of Cyber Resilience Field Solutions Architects. I hope he's getting paid by the word in his title. He'll do very well. I've had the pleasure of being with Scott before. He's a really smart guy. We appreciate the support that Pure Storage gives to Chime as a member there. I'll let Scott just start with sort of giving me a day in the life of what you do at Pure Storage, and then we'll move on with the Q&A. Thanks for joining us, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Frank. Great to be here again this year. So, yeah, it is kind of a long title, and you forgot the America's Theater part too, just to stretch it out a little bit. But the fancy words or whatever, everybody wants to come up with different titles. But effectively, I have a team of specialized systems engineers. We specialize in the field of cyber resilience, and we'll talk about a little bit more what that makes. So, day in and day out, myself, my team, we're actually going out and speaking with customers and helping them try to either prevent or more likely recover successfully when these type of attacks happen out there.
Great. So let's just jump into the questions. And the first one might be sort of a blinding glimpse of the obvious, but I mean, things have changed so much. So what happened just 9 months ago might not be the same year, same this year. What do you see in terms of why healthcare is so uniquely vulnerable to these ransom attacks, and what gaps do attackers continue to exploit in healthcare? And obviously those have changed dramatically. So curious about your point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. So healthcare tends to be like either the number one or number two most targeted industry for these cyber events that happen. And I think it's a few different things. The reality is a lot of the healthcare industry is low margin, right? So there's not a lot of excess money that's just laying around for companies to invest. Yet at the same time, they have extremely valuable data, right? Personally identifiable,
Mhm.
very sensitive health information type data. So they're a very rich target environment. And they also have limited money to figure out, where do I invest? Do I invest in helping, my practitioners? Do I invest in new equipment so that I can either take on, new procedures, or, maybe expand
Mhm.
or afford to pay where we may have actually staff shortages? Or do I put this into IT systems? And often that choice ends up being, of course, hey, I want to take care of my patients. I'm going to put it towards where I think it's going to impact patient care most of all. And unfortunately, that means that IT is often left with less resources than they should be. And it's one of the industries that seems to get a little bit of a lack of investment, right? Just to be a little bit frank. And so they
Mhm.
tend to be a little more susceptible in the technology space to these types of things. The other thing that we see too more and more is that healthcare is critical infrastructure. So it's not always just the financially motivated individuals that are going after our health systems. It's actually nation state actors too. And they don't always show themselves. They do like to kind of hang out in the environment a little bit and wait for something to happen before they strike. But you can imagine if the US were to get into some kind of conflict, not that we would, do that or have done that recently, of course, but if we did, one of our adversaries may be laying in strike. And if we did have people where we needed, a lot of health system access, they would be willing to disrupt that at that time. So I think those are some of the big things. I was listening a little bit to the gentleman from Marsh. Things like AI have actually made this way easier for people to pull off the attacks. And so there's more and more people that are able now to access the ability to pull off something like this that wouldn't have had the technical skills in the past to do that. So I'll pause there, but I think those are some of the things that we've seen that have kind of made healthcare a little more susceptible than other industries to these attacks.
That's a great way to frame it. So Pure has taken great efforts to coin this layered resilience architecture term. It just sort of begs the question, obviously, what are the layers, and what is the multifaceted aspect of this that makes it different and fortifies the system in the enterprise?
Yeah, so the thought around this is, looking at a defense in depth type of approach, right? I want to have different layers of defense. The reality is that there's nothing that is bulletproof right? Unfortunately, humans have made all these systems. That means that there's going to be some kind of vulnerability out there that happens regardless of how secure or well-intentioned the company might be and what they're putting out. So we believe in that defense in depth and having these layers that really should be complementary to each other. So when it comes from a pure storage perspective, what we're doing is a couple different things. One, we're building a strong ecosystem so that we can integrate in with more traditional security type companies who are out there more from a prevention, a detection, a visibility type perspective. And then we're bringing in an ability to actually protect that data itself and give that data integrity and work with some of our other data protection partners to ensure that you can have a quick and clean recovery. So when it does happen, and we'll talk about that, but when it does happen to you, that you're able to get back in business serving your patients faster than you can do. And it's one of those things, our kind of belief and why we go with this kind of a layer type architecture is it's not one company that has a single bullet, right? If
Hmm.
there's any company that says we're going to come in and we're going to stop this, or we're your one key to get everything back online and running again, that they're missing the boat. And so we believe in that ecosystem approach as far as our layered resilience architecture and bringing best of breed type vendors to the market where we're all working together to actually solve this problem for our customers. I think another aspect of this is recovery from a cyber event is not the same thing as traditional DR. And we see this with a lot of customers. They have their traditional DR plan. We've spent the past, we'll call it decade or so, making those really solid, maybe even automate them. And when they stress test that and they put that through a cyber event, they find out very quickly it doesn't work. And it's not that there's not overlapping things, but they were fundamentally meant to solve different problems. DR events typically are not malicious type events, right? You don't have a hurricane going actively after your backups trying to destroy them or your replication copies trying to destroy them. But you do in a cyber event, right? That's one of the first steps that they're going to take is they're going to figure out what mechanisms do you have in place where you might be able to recover, and they're going to go after those and they're going to try to destroy them before they do anything to try to exploit you. Another aspect we've seen, and I don't know if I didn't catch the entire March session, so I don't know if they commented on this or not. But we've seen where the infrastructure itself might become a crime scene. So that might be a federal agency or some other law enforcement agency coming in and saying, depending on who this threat actor was that attacked you, we may need to actually have a look at this and figure out what's going on. And if you refer back to the critical infrastructure comment I made earlier, a little bit more susceptible to nation state actors, that's a real threat, from a healthcare perspective that they might come in. We've also, seen instances where other interested parties, we'll call it, may come in and say, hey, we need to do an investigation of this environment before we can release it to you back in there. And so again, that's not something you see in a traditional DR type event where you're expecting that I can fail over to this other site and everything's good to go. And that just may not be the case when you're talking about, a cyber type event or cyber extortion event, as a lot of people on the team like to call it now.
Interesting. I like the hurricane part. That was interesting. So I have to ask you. We talked about layers. We talked about data protection. In the area of recovery, you mentioned rapid recovery. I'm curious what technologies, what advanced technologies are being used right now to make that kind of recovery rapid, as opposed to lingering, I guess you would say, which we know has happened at sometimes where people say, "Well, we've got three days to fix this breach, and so just fasten your seatbelt in the meantime."
Yep. We've talked to a lot of customers, and the first place that the industry went was their traditional backup and recovery software platforms, right? Which might be in some cases, believe it or not, still on tape. In most cases, it's actually probably on some disk-based target that they've had for 5 or 6 years, where that system wasn't designed to handle a cyber event. It was designed to optimize for backup windows, maybe reduce your
Mhm.
data, give you the lowest TCO possible for your backup copies because it was an insurance policy that most people thought they would never use. And then the world has quickly changed. And what you find is that moving that data and moving it off of slower media, it just takes too long. And so you typically talk about days or weeks for recovery. And oftentimes people will challenge that, but all you have to do is go look at the news, right? And you can see that that's actually what it takes these companies to recover. And so the other part with some of those systems I mentioned earlier is they're going to go after your protection mechanisms, right? The threat actors are going to come in, they're going to look for your backups. They're going to look for not only your backups, they're going to look for your snapshots that are on your storage array. We've seen this as well. They're going to destroy your replication copies. So you need a mechanism in place to protect those. And in the pure world, we have something that we call safe mode that actually makes those copies not only, you know, immutable but indelible. Some people will intersperse those words as the same thing, but meaning that not only can you not, change them, you actually can't remove them. So even if you're a privileged user or an administrator, if you will, in the environment, you're still not going to be able to remove these copies of data. So that means that when someone comes into your environment and they elevate their credentials and they now have, godlike powers over your equipment, they're still not going to be able to remove these copies of data, whether that's the snapshots, whether it's your data protection copies with one of our data protection partners. We're going to keep that environment as safe as possible. And when we are able to do recovery from those snapshots, we can do that without physically having to move data around. And I also want to be clear here, right? When we talk about any kind of restore process that's happening, the first step when you get hit by one of these events is not just to start restoring your production. If you do that, you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt because, first of all, if you didn't kind of shut the door and the threat actors are still in your environment, they're just going to re-encrypt everything. They're going to taunt you. They're probably going to raise the ransom. But also, if you just start restoring, you don't know if you have a clean copy of your data. You're very likely to restore the malware again. It's going to run. You're going to find yourself in the same spot. We've seen a couple instances of this where customers have been hit twice um, by different groups in some of those cases because they started their recovery, but they forgot to make sure that everything was actually in a good state. And another group came in and just exploited the same, vulnerability and caused actually even more damage typically than the first group did. So we have to think about how do we help get this up as fast as possible? So if I have to go through and I'm pulling from tape or even slow kind of disk type environments, I'm not pulling that to get myself back in production. I'm pulling that to give a copy, to an analyst who can look through this and say, hey, yes, this is good. I don't see any indicators of compromised, or hey, half this environment is still actually encrypted. We just didn't catch it yet. We need another copy of that data. And we've seen customers have to go back 2, 3, 4 different versions of their data.
Mhm.
And every time you're typically talking days or multiple days, just depending on how old their technology is to be able to do that. If we do something where we can do it without moving the data and we have a data integrity mechanism on there like safe mode, we can actually almost instantaneously give those copies to our incident responders to validate, to look at that's clean. We're also go back to the ecosystem thing. Again, we partner with leading data protection companies that are out there, like a Rubrik, and we actually have a really nice integration now where you can see inside of our interface where Rubrik has designated one of these snapshots as good in their mind, or hey, there's some suspicious things here that we need to look at. So is that everything you need to do to validate? Probably not. I wouldn't be comfortable with just one technology, but it gives me a much faster head start to say, you know what? Rubrik in this case has already identified that this might be dirty data. I'm not even going to waste my time looking at that version. I'm going to start with something that looks like it's in a much better shape, right? To enable me to restore much
Mhm.
faster. Another concept I want to, kind of bring up here too is the isolated recovery environment. We are seeing this become a hotter and hotter topic, and we're actually seeing, a lot of our healthcare customers ask about this. And it does a few different things. One, it's an area that you can kind of quarantine off a little bit. And, there's a lot around that identity and access management things you need to do from a security perspective to make sure that it's truly as isolated as it possibly can be. But it's getting a copy of your information into this isolated environment where you can run forensics. You can actually look and have your incident responders clean that data, look at it. And if you needed to, you could actually start to run part of your production environment off of that. So see back to some of the earlier comments, let's say a 3-letter agency comes in and says, hey, sorry, this is now, a crime scene. You can't run on this infrastructure anymore. What do? You're not waiting, a week or two for somebody to get you replacement infrastructure. I've actually got something I could at least get some of my basic critical services back up and
Mhm.
running in that case. And this is all kind of in service to reducing what we call our work recovery time, which is traditionally we think of the RPO and the RTO, which are still good metrics, but they're not everything that's involved. Just getting your data back up and online and saying, hey, our storage is available, or maybe even our virtual machines or our servers have spun up. That's not everything you need to do to get back into production. So we look at that more holistically as our work recovery time. Did I have to, go back in and re-enter data that was manually put in when I had to go back to paper processes, things like that? So we're trying to reduce that piece as much as possible. And having that immutable and indelible copy and having that isolated recovery environment are two big ways that we're seeing right now that customers are using to reduce that work recovery time.
That's great. So, by the theme of this conference, we're looking at tactical aspects of cybersecurity. Obviously, prevention is a large part of that. One of the mantras is resilience. We'll use it every way, shape, and form. So, I think the question is there true resilience, or what is the next generation of resilience, or what is a post-resilience world, as I like to call it, when it comes to transformation? And tell me a little bit about the how you see the investment patterns in prevention versus resilience, and if sometimes those investment patterns can compromise or not compromise the existing resilience strategy.
Yeah. I mentioned this or at least alluded to it earlier. We like to say it's not if, it's not even when, it's how soon and how often, right?
Mhm.
And the thing that we like to tell customers, when you're a defender, you have to be right 100% of the time. That is almost impossible in any part of life, right? Your adversaries only have to be right once to get through and cause severe damage. So we like to tell customers now you should have that assume breach mindset. We've actually been talking to a couple of security companies around potential partnerships where that's actually where they're starting, which is something that you haven't seen so much from the security side of things before, right? Very much in, hey, we can stop this, we can stop this. So we're actually seeing a couple of players come up that say, you know what, we're just not going to be able to stop it. How do we contain? How do we minimize? How do we act as quickly as possible? And so that's kind of our mindset out there for customers. We want to stop as much as we can, but we have to assume that a breach is going to happen at some point. And how do we make sure that you're as protected as possible and you can recover as quickly as possible? The security spend is traditionally what we've done, right? I think Gartner's numbers, something like $215 billion last year spent on products and services to try to prevent and detect these kinds of threats. And of course, considering that this is a big topic of your conference today, we know that just spending more money has not been working, right? So um, putting more money out into the market in the security bucket or the security bucket from prevention detection, adding more tools, adding more complexity is not actually solving our problem. It doesn't mean that we don't want to spend there because you still want to try to stop as much as you possibly can. Again, that's why we're building our ecosystem to go bigger. But we're starting to see some companies realize I need to shift some of that budget more towards being prepared for recovery. Do I have things like the isolated recovery environment? Am I doing, I think the Marsh gentleman mentioned this earlier too, the tabletop exercises. Do I have a plan and am I practicing the plan? From our perspective, when we look at NIST adding in that governance layer into their cybersecurity framework, a lot of that is around having a plan and actually testing it and making sure it works. We will do these mock tabletop exercises with customers as well, and it's very eye opening for them. We tend to throw a lot at them in that process that they're like, oh, I didn't think about that. Right. I didn't think about, wait a second, I've tried to make things easy for my users, which is not a bad thing to do. But by doing that, I've actually made things way more easier for an adversary to come in and gain access to a lot of our systems. So we are starting to see that mindset shift a little bit, where it's
Mhm.
not just spend on prevent, detect, but have a realization we have to have a good recovery strategy.
Interesting. So a lot of enterprises are looking at the non-data aspects of resilience, and wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the layering approach takes into consider these non-data elements.
Yeah, the non-data elements, well, meaning your not your actual data. So I'll go
Exactly.
back a little bit to some of the ecosystem things. So some of the stuff that we're working on there or already have and continue to enhance is actually doing things like sending data to a SEM platform. And you may wonder why. Well, attackers get in various ways, and all of these different tools only have usually a piece of the puzzle. And so, SIM's one of the places where we can kind of consolidate and correlate a lot of this information. And we see things that are going on from a data pattern perspective that may indicate that there is some kind of threat in the environment, may indicate that there might be an exfiltration event going on. And so we're trying to send quality, high fidelity information to those tool sets and give them more things to correlate, ultimately, hopefully reducing mean time to detection. Because at some point, you're still going to have to detect that something's wrong. And the faster you can identify that, the better chance you have to contain it before you actually have a large recovery effort, or you can at least get started on your recovery effort a lot faster. We've seen some customers that An attack has happened, they know it, but they were able to see it fast enough when it was going on that they were able to prevent large portions of their environment from actually being compromised in that case and deleted in their particular case, the one I'm thinking of. So that dramatically reduced their recovery efforts and let them get back into business faster. But we fully believe that that ecosystem thing and sharing is much high fidelity signals intelligence, if you
Mhm.
will, with the ecosystem makes us all that much stronger.
We're coming to a close, but want to look at the futuristic aspects of this. We used to say 3 to 5 years, and it sort of meant 3 to 5 years, but 3 to 5 years now, in terms of technology evolution, is in a completely different world. I'm just wondering what advice you're giving people that are doing their 3 year plans, to the extent they still do them, or maybe their 5 year plans, as to what they have to prepare for in order to build that kind of resilience and protection that we've been talking about in this presentation.
Yeah, I'll throw a couple of things out. Interestingly, I was about a month and a half ago at a financial institution, we'll call it, and this was actually a meeting for some of their top partners,
Mhm.
and their CIO was speaking. And this individual, the entire day, they have been talking about two things: cybersecurity and agentic AI. And at the end of this, this individual said, "Look, we need our top partners to keep us abreast of what's going on, to keep us informed, to bring us ideas." We spent all day talking about things like agentic AI. A year ago, that wasn't even a thing we were talking about. Like it didn't almost didn't even exist, at this point about a year ago. And so the world is changing so fast. I almost laugh every time I hear somebody say, "What are you going to do in the next 3 to 5 years?" Who knows, right? We don't know what that
Mhm.
really looks like. But a few things to throw out. We're definitely seeing people start to talk more and more about end-to-end encryption. Why aren't we doing that, right? Why are we leaving data exposed at any point inside of our process? I think the other thing that we have to watch out for that's starting to become a lot more common, we've seen the double extortion thing where, hey, I'm going to encrypt and I'm also going to exfiltrate your data. We're starting to see almost a little bit of a shift to just the exfiltration, right? Why even bother, spending the time trying to encrypt and
Mhm.
hanging around for too long? Let me just exfiltrate that data. Let me threaten to expose it. Let me publicly shame you if I can, if you don't pay me, right? So that's a bigger thing. And that's not super easy to kind of stop, right? I'm not going to name names, but if everybody's been watching the headlines for the past couple of weeks, there's quite a few of those attacks happening right now in real time, where it's all about threatening to expose sensitive data from these companies. Um, a lot of this, of course, in the healthcare industry, it's a human welfare issue. And so if we go back to things like that IRE, we're kind of at the start where really people are starting to think about that, and does that actually make sense? And nobody wants to spend money on things that aren't specifically to help patients out. But at the same time, we have to think about, how do we have like a minimally viable EHR that's available to our clinicians so that when this happens, we can take care of people to minimize that human welfare impact. I think those things are super important. The other thing I'll say is, I think that all, regardless of what industry, healthcare, finance, it doesn't matter, we have to start being really, really picky about who we partner with from a technology perspective. Another thing we haven't mentioned, or I haven't mentioned today, other people may have, is the supply chain attack, right? And if stuff is getting built into the software that you're running, or you're in a SaaS provider, and you can't trust that provider, whether it's software, SaaS, cloud, it doesn't really matter who, that they're, have the same level of resilience, the same level of security controls and practices that you have, you are leaving yourself vulnerable. And unfortunately, in those cases, you really don't have a great way to detect that that's going on until it's too late and you read about your company, in the news, or you get a letter, right, demanding some kind of ransom. So I think that third party validation of who you're partnering with is actually going to continue to become more and more critical, especially as people do more and more from a SaaS perspective. If you can't trust the partners that you're working with, then it doesn't matter how secure you are internally, somebody else is going to leave you exposed.
That's great. So just a closing question. We have a couple more minutes. I'd lose my journalistic credentials if I didn't mention something about ROI. In terms of the people, I mean, budgets are tight. Many CFOs are trying to make cybersecurity in their providers a revenue center in some way. We're still trying to figure out how to do that. I'm just wondering what the return on investment pitch is in terms of the layered approach.
Yeah, I think you know, it's always been hard in a quote data protection DR, whatever you're looking at, to have a quote meaningful ROI. We are starting to look at things, and this I think is more of an insurance thing around reducing annualized loss expectancy, right? I think that's an important thing to actually look at for customers. The challenge is that the ROI is often hard to substantiate upfront, but when you need this technology, if you don't have it in place, you quickly find out how much it pays for itself. So it's kind of a sad state that we have to purchase and buy these things, but it is very critical. And unfortunately, there's so many examples that the relatively minimal amount you could have spent would have saved you from literally hundreds, or in a few cases we've seen in the healthcare industry, billion-plus-dollar losses in the environment. And we think that that layered approach, the ROI is really in how fast we can get you back up and running and how many of those attacks we
Mhm.
can minimize in the first place. Again, it's a little bit hard to, crystallize, other than maybe send some of your executives, the latest articles around your peers who have been attacked and how much money it costs them versus the relatively little amount of money you're looking at to implement this type of an approach.
Fantastic. Scott, it's always great talking with you. Appreciate the support from Pure Storage, and we thank the audience for hanging in there. And I'm going to be handing it back over to Lisa Gallagher. Thanks again, Scott.